Who was Hiram Abiff? Part 3, Chapter 4. Astarte A and Adonis in Syria and Cyprus. The legend of Adonis is best known to us from the Greek version, the word Adonis being merely a Hellenized form of his title, Adonai. The Greeks, a refined and civilized race, undoubtedly modified both the legend and the rites connected therewith, omitting many of the more repulsive features. According to the Greeks, Aphrodite loved the child Adonis as an infant and hid him in a chest which she placed in charge of Persephone, the queen of the underworld. But as soon as Persephone saw the lovely babe, she refused to restore it to Aphrodite, although the goddess descended into the underworld itself in a desperate effort to recover the child. At length, Zeus intervened and decided that Adonis must remain with Aphrodite for half the year, but during the rest of it he must dwell with Persephone. At last Adonis was slain, either by a boar or, according to other accounts, by Ares, the god of war, who disguised himself as a wild boar in order to compass the death of his rival in Aphrodite's affections. There exists an interesting representation of the contest between Aphrodite and Persephone on an Etruscan mirror, wherein we see the two goddesses on either side of Zeus, who is sternly admonishing Persephone. Aphrodite, in bitter grief, buries her face in her mantle, while her opponent holds a branch in one hand and with her other points at a closed chest, which probably contains the infant Adonis. The confiding of the infant Adonis to Persephone no doubt symbolizes the planting of the seed in autumn. The period spent with Aphrodite represents spring and early summer when the corn is growing. The actual death represents the harvesting of the grain, at which time the great lamentation took place. In this connection, readers should note that, in the curious legend I have quoted on page 180, Hiram descended into the fiery underworld, reascended to earth, completed his work, and then was slain. The branch in the hand of Persephone represents the plant into which the soul of the vegetation god has been transferred, and brings to mind the branch mentioned in Ezekiel 8:17, and also the sprig of acacia. The fact that there were two descents into the underworld, at seed time and at harvest, no doubt explains a problem which has puzzled many scholars. For whereas in some places the lamentation for Tammuz seems to have been in late spring or early summer, in others it appears to have occurred in autumn. In Palestine, the barley harvest was in March-April and the wheat harvest in May-June, and a festival of lamentation during any part of that period would represent the slaying of the adult god. A similar festival in autumn or early winter would represent the depositing of the infant god in the hands of the goddess of the underworld, thereby symbolizing the planting of the seed. Further, although the fact is not made clear in the Greek legend, originally Tammuz was the son as well as the mate of the Great Mother, for the corn is brought forth by her, is planted next season in her womb, and perishes in order that she may bear more corn children. In Syria, the greatest center of the Adonis cult was at Byblos, whose Semitic name was Gebal. It was situated on the sea-coast, but there were also several other important shrines to which we shall refer in due course. Byblos was said to have been founded by El, a name also used by the Jews for God. The great sanctuary of Astarte A is described by Lucian, who tells us that a great cone, representing Astarte A, rose in the midst of a fine courtyard, which was surrounded by cloisters. The river which ran close by was called Adonis, and descended thence from its source near the other great shrine on Mount Lebanon, namely Aphaka. This was the kingdom of the semi-mythical Cinyras, and up to the close of its existence, it was ruled by kings who may have been assisted by a kind of senate. It was from the name of the town, Gebal, that the words Giblim and Giblitz originated. The names of these kings, e.g. Adam-Melech and Yeharbal, seem to indicate that they claimed to be of divine descent, a custom almost universal among the Semitic races throughout the whole of this area. We certainly know that the kings of the neighboring city of Tyre claimed to be the offspring of Baal and gods, even during their life on earth. One of these kings of Tyre called himself Abimelech, which means father of the king, or father of Moloch, and is a title which implies that its bearer was the father of a god. From this we see that the title of Hiram Abiff, i.e., father of the exaltation of life, etc., becomes perfectly intelligible. If one Tyrian king called himself the father of Moloch, why should not another call himself the father of the exaltation of life, or use the even more significant title of the father of him who destroys, a title peculiarly suitable to Moloch, to whom victims were burnt alive? Fraser points out that it was a regular Semitic custom to call a man the father of so-and-so, when that so-and-so was a king, for the king was considered a god king. A similar custom prevailed in Egypt, where the kings were literally worshipped as divines. There the wife of the king was called the wife of the god, or the mother of the god, as the case might be, and the title father of the god was borne not only by the king's real father, but also by his father-in-law. Names such as Abibaal, father of Baal, and Abijah, father of Jehovah, imply that a man was, in some strange way, father of the god, and such a custom becomes intelligible only when we realize that the god was supposed to transfer his divine soul from one generation of kings to the next. It seems, moreover, as if a king at the birth of his heir was supposed automatically to lose his divine soul, which henceforth dwelt in his son. In some places, a man regularly assumed the name of his son, and so a divine king in later life might often be called father of so-and-so. In this Semitic custom, we have an explanation of the curious fact that Adoniram's father, Abda, called himself the father of the beloved, the beloved being a title of Adonis, thereby incidentally implying that Adoniram, the man, had within him the divine soul of Adonis. In like manner, the Phoenician architect similarly called himself the father of him that destroys, and the title, he that destroys, was that by which Hiram, the reigning king of Tyre, was known. This fact suggests that he likewise had passed on to his son the divine soul of the god, namely that God whom the Tyrian kings claimed to be. Josephus informs us that the father of King Hiram was called Abibaal, which means, of course, the father of the god, and implies that he, at any rate, survived the period at which his son became the recipient of the divine soul. It would thus appear as if Abibaal and Hiram Abiff were the same persons. Certainly their titles imply precisely the same thing and connect up with the same king of Tyre, Hiram. If then it was originally the custom for the king of Tyre, like other divine kings, to be sacrificed when his body grew old, in order that the divine soul might pass into another and younger body, we can easily understand that in the course of years, such a sacrifice might be mitigated. When the king grew old, he would abdicate and would possibly pretend to die, and his son would thereupon inherit the divine soul, and with it the kingdom. Henceforth the older man would have lost his former divine title and assumed that of the father of the god, or the father of him that destroys. My readers must definitely realize one important fact. During this period, and long after it, Syria literally swarmed with priest kings who were believed to be the incarnations of their god. We have occasion to refer to several of these later, but there is one feature common to practically all of them. The man who assumed the doubtful privilege of representing the incarnate God and being his priest king lost his personal name, and in its place took the name and title of the god. For example, the high priest of Sibley was called Addis, and also Papa, meaning father, the latter being a title of Addis. Although, however, the old savage custom of killing the king as soon as he grew old may, by the time of Solomon, have been mitigated, as we have indicated, yet at times of emergency and on occasions of great solemnity, we find that nations constantly hark back to their savage and original customs. At such a moment, a royal victim would be required. Sometimes, no doubt, a royal son or cousin might serve. But if the old king was still alive, he would be the most obvious sacrifice. According to popular beliefs, he ought to have died when his son ascended the throne. He had lived for several years beyond his allotted span. Therefore, he was the man to represent the real king and die in his place. Perhaps the completion of the great temple at Jerusalem was regarded by the less civilized Phoenician workmen as just such an occasion as required that the old king should die, and with his blood consecrate the temple. Reverting to the kings of Byblos and Tyre, we find that some, at any rate, were not only kings but also priests of Astarte. We learn in the same passage that the father of Hiram called himself Abibalus, i.e., Abibaal, which means the father of Baal, and that there was a line of priest kings of Astarte, who included one called Pygmalion, a name whose significance will become clearer when we turn to Cyprus. According to Josephus, it was the sister of Pygmalion, Dido, who built Carthage. From the above, we see that the kings of Tyre were priest kings, and that King Hiram himself had a father who used the title of father of the god Baal, and that this man appears to correspond with Hiram Abiff. In these circumstances, it seems desirable to decide exactly who the Baal of Tyre was. He was Melkarth, Moloch, whom the Greeks identified with Hercules, and this fact is borne out by Josephus, who tells us that King Hiram built and consecrated the temples of Hercules and Astarte. He also tells us that Baal was the god of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, however, usually called him Melkarth, which means the divine king, while the alternative title Baal merely means god. This Phoenician Baal was a god of fertility, more especially of corn and wine, although he also had under his protection the animals. Indeed, these are the characteristics of the chief god of all the non-Jewish Semites, while the Greek Hercules was merely this male Semitic deity imported into Greece and Hellenized. We shall learn a good deal about him from their literature when we come to the chapter on the dying god in Asia Minor. Robertson Smith admirably summarizes the attributes of this great Semitic deity in the words, "The Baal was conceived as the male principle of reproduction, the husband of the land he fertilized." Fraser considers that these Semitic kings personated their god and had to marry the goddess of the earth, Astarte. In short, we may say that Baal and Tammuz were really the same deity, although perhaps viewed from a slightly different angle. The last king of Byblos was called Cinyras. He was slain by Pompey, and the founder of the line was also Cinyras, the reputed father of Adonis, who is said to have built a shrine on Mount Lebanon, which was almost certainly Afaka, now a small village called Afka. The whole district was sacred to Adonis, Tammuz, and at Guinea nearby is depicted the following sculpture. Astarte is seated in a position of utter grief, while Adonis with spear in hand awaits the attack of a bear, not, be it noted, a boar. As the goddess herself was originally a bear goddess, we see that Adonis was really destroyed by Astarte in her primitive and bestial form, despite the crocodile tears she sheds. The significant fact, however, is that every year Adonis was supposed to be slain. The river ran red with his blood, and the scarlet anemones sprang from his freshly shed blood amid the cedars of Lebanon. At this period of the year, Lucian tells us, the Syrian maidens wept for Adonis, slain. Thus we see that the worship of Tammuz was not only inseparably interwoven with the lives of the people of Palestine, but the very king who helped Solomon to build his temple was himself a representative and a descendant of the dying god, not merely a devoted worshipper of him or of his divine mistress, but in some strange way an earthly incarnation of a god who every year was slain in order that the earth might be fertilized. At Hierapolis, the modern Membiji, Lucian further informs us that there were two large phalli, 30 fathoms high, which stood at the door of the temple of Astarte A, and that twice every year a man, probably one of the castrated Galli or priests, climbed to the summit from the inside, where he was supposed to hold converse with the gods to ensure the prosperity and fertility of the land. In reality, he dramatically represented the process of fertilization which produced the new priest-king. Here then we see not only the true nature of the two pillars in the porch of King Solomon's temple, but also the reason why they were made hollow. The explanation that this was to enable them to serve as archives was no doubt invented after the original object had been forgotten. Let us now pass to Cyprus, which, colonized by Phoenicians, was the other great center of the worship of Adonis and Astarte A, from whence these rites spread to Greece. There were several shrines to Adonis in Cyprus, as for example, at Amathus, where the rites of Adonis were so similar to those of Osiris that some of the ancients considered he was Osiris. The most famous shrine, however, was at Paphos, the modern Kuklia, and we can form a very good idea of its appearance from the coins of the time of the Caesars, and also from certain votive gold models found in the tombs at Mycenae, which must be some 1,200 years earlier than the coins, and show that but little change had taken place in the general plan and design in all the centuries which had elapsed between that period and the beginning of the Christian era. As the date of these models is some 200 years earlier than the traditional date of the building of King Solomon's temple, and the work was undoubtedly Phoenician, the details of the shrine at Paphos may explain certain peculiar features of the temple at Jerusalem built by Phoenician workmen. On coins and models alike, we find a facade, on top of which are two doves. The facade is divided into three parts, or chapels, the central part having a tall superstructure. This central part contains a cone, on either side of which is a lofty pillar, each terminating in a pair of ball-top pinnacles, with a star and crescent appearing between the tops of the columns. In each of the side chapels, a similar pillar appears. Perched on various parts of the building are doves, the well-known emblem of Astarte A. The cone symbolized the goddess herself, and is perhaps a crude representation of the female symbol, just as the pillars present the phallus. Their duplication may be merely for the purpose of symmetry, but this is unlikely, and it is more probable that originally they symbolized the dying god, A, as the father, and B, as the son. For it must be remembered that Tammuz, who died when he mated with the goddess, was reborn as her son, destined in due course to suffer the same fate as his father, who was indeed himself. Such folly flanking pagodas are still found in Buddhist countries, particularly in Burma and Siam. In Bangkok, there is a phallus of enormous height, which each year is repainted, the lower part in some dark color, such as brown, and the top red, the result being unpleasantly realistic. The two great pillars of red wood set up outside the gates of the Burmese exhibit at Wembley in 1924 were, of course, also phalli, though in Burma this fact seems to have been forgotten. If we now compare this shrine with the account of Solomon's temple, we shall recognize several important features therein. The dome, to which reference is made in a certain Masonic tradition, corresponds with the cone or superstructure at Paphos. The two pillars with their globes also become intelligible, and even the ornate chapiters with their detailed carving, conveying the idea of fertility, are nothing more than the remains of the prepuce, the rest being removed in circumcision, artistically disguised. The three parts of the building correspond with the general design of the eastern facade of the temple, and though we have no mention of the dove, we know that up to the time of the Romans, doves were on sale in the temple for the purpose of burnt offerings. There seems therefore no doubt that in its main outline, King Solomon's temple corresponded with the temples of Astarte A. There is one fact whose significance we must not overlook. There is no mention in the Bible of the globes. No doubt in reality, these were domes, not true globes, and the fact that they indicated a phallic significance was not overlooked by the Hebrew revisers, who deleted all reference to them. Nevertheless, the Masonic tradition has retained them, and therein is undoubtedly correct. This fact is but one of many small pieces of evidence which show that the Masonic tradition has come down from a time previous to the revision of the Bible by the Hebrew champions of monotheism, and thus indicates the genuine antiquity of the Masonic ceremonies. The evidence in support of the view that the cone is an emblem of the Great Mother is abundant. It was under this symbol that she was worshipped at Byblos, at Perga in Pamphylia, in Malta, a Phoenician settlement, and at Sinai, the sacred stone of Cybele, which was brought by the Romans to the Eternal City during the Second Punic War. When they established the savage rites of the Great Mother at the Vatican, was a small, black, jagged piece of rock which formed the face of the statue, but it is not certain whether it was conical in shape or not. It was, however, black, not white, and in this connection we should remember that in the Song of Solomon, the female lover, who undoubtedly represents Astarte, says, "I am black, but comely." Probably the black stone of the Kaaba at Mecca originally represented the same goddess. At Paphos, it was customary to anoint this cone, and as showing how old customs survive long after the religion which begot them has apparently been replaced by another, it is interesting to know that this custom is still maintained at Paphos today. D.G. Hogarth tells us that, in honor of the Maid of Bethlehem, the peasants of Kuklia, Paphos, anointed lately, and probably still anoint each year, the great cornerstones of the ruined temple of the Paphian goddess. As Aphrodite Astarte was supplicated once with cryptic rites, so is Mary entreated still by Muslims, as well as Christians, with incantations and passings through perforated stones, to remove the curse of barrenness from Cypriot women, or increase the manhood of Cypriot men. Passing through a hole in a stone or tree is found as a rite of rebirth all over the world, and such rites are often resorted to in the hope that as a result thereof the blight of disease, and especially of barrenness, will be removed. If this old ceremony of anointing the stone still survives today, may not other rites of Adonis have likewise survived? Indeed, so strong is the hold that the ancient goddess has on the Cypriot peasantry that they still use her name and worship the Virgin Mary under the title of Panagia Aphroditessa. So much for the great shrine at Paphos, but what of the kings of that city? According to legend, a Syrian named Sandicus went to Cilicia and married the daughter of the king of that country, in time becoming king. Now Sandicus is clearly the same as Sandan, a North Syrian god who corresponds very closely to Melkarth of Tyre, and therefore to one aspect of Adonis. This Sandicus had a son, Cinyras, who went to Cyprus and married the daughter of Pygmalion, the king of that country. He then founded Paphos and became the father of Adonis. We have already mentioned that Sandicus has the same name as Sandan, a variation of Melkarth, who like that god was burnt. So we will now turn to consider Cinyras. His name is identical with the mythical founder of Byblos, who, like his Cypriot namesake, was the father of Adonis. In short, all three were in turn the human embodiments of Tammuz. But Pygmalion, the father of the wife of Cinyras, and therefore grandfather of Adonis, was himself a human incarnation of Tammuz. This Pygmalion, we are told, fell in love with the statue of Aphrodite and took it to bed. Ovid later, when relating the story, changed the king into a sculptor and the image into a statue of a beautiful woman. But the above was the original version of the story, and indicates that the Phoenician king had to go through the ceremony of marrying a statue of Astarte to symbolize his marriage to the goddess. A somewhat similar custom still prevails in India, except that it is a girl who marries the statue of a god, and henceforth is a temple prostitute. Now Cinyras is said to have been a lover of Aphrodite, and begot his son incestuously with his daughter Myrrha at a harvest festival to the goddess. It should be noted that in the Syrian stories of the birth of Adonis, sometimes other kings are mentioned as the father, but usually the mother is described as their daughter. Such incestuous acts are probably a latter-day description of a former royal custom, whose object was to keep the crown in the royal male line at a time when succession went by the female. They are parallel to the custom of the Egyptian pharaohs, who married their own sisters, although the whole question of exogamy with its totemic prohibitions is involved, which cannot be discussed here. The four kings thus consist of three who were lovers of Aphrodite, each in their turn, while Sandicus also corresponds to Adonis. Thus it would appear as if we had a succession of Syrian priest kings who considered themselves incarnations of the lover of the Great Mother, Astarte, and no doubt annually went through the ceremony of being married to her. Sandicus seems to correspond with Sandan or Melkarth, and therefore it is desirable to indicate the relationship between Melkarth and Tammuz. Melkarth was the Baal, or Lord of Fertility, who annually mated with the Great Mother, and in consequence died, but was reincarnated in his son. As the living divine king of the city, he was worshipped under the title of Melkarth, but when he assumed his aspect of the dying god, he was bewailed as Tammuz or Adonis. In short, he was at once the husband and the son of Astarte. There seems to be evidence, moreover, that all the sons of the human representatives of this divinity were considered as like him, divine, and it was no doubt this fact which enabled the custom of slaying them, and yet not destroying the whole royal house, to be maintained. It seems certain, moreover, that the annual marriage of these kings consisted of a more or less temporary union with the sacred women, or sacred prostitutes as they are often called, who were always attached to the temples of Astarte. In Palestine, these women were called Kedesoth, Kadosh, a word which, strictly speaking, means sacred women. In such circumstances, the supply of divine men, the offspring of such unions, would be fairly numerous, and the women themselves seem to have been regarded as human representatives of the Great Mother. Perhaps the Kedishim, or sacred men, whom Josiah turned out of the temple of Jehovah, were the superfluous divine men, the offspring of the sacred women. This seems the more probable, as in some areas, such as the Caucasus, it was one of these sacred men who was annually slain. For all that, each year there must have been one man who, for the time being, peculiarly represented Tammuz, and in order to invest him with this doubtful privilege, certain rites were performed at the time of the death of his predecessor. What these rites were, we shall discover when we come to consider similar processes of transferring the divine soul in other lands. But among them, no doubt, was that of sniffing at a bough which grew out of the grave, the stepping over the grave or corpse, and so forth. The father of the man thus chosen to represent Tammuz might be proud to call himself the father of so-and-so. To return to Adonis in Cyprus, we find that he was said to have reigned there just as he did at Byblos, and his descendants regularly used the name Adonis. Nor was this title, Adon, restricted to the reigning king, but was borne by all his sons. Now, just as there was a Cypriot Cinyras and a similarly named king at Byblos, so there was not only a Pygmalion in Cyprus, but at least two of that name who reigned in Tyre. The one who is mentioned by Josephus was the father of Dido, foundress of Carthage, who, according to legend, burnt herself on the funeral pyre when Aeneas refused to stay with her. Death by fire seems to have been a popular method among the Phoenicians, for Hamilcar also burnt himself to death after his defeat. Since, according to all the legends, Adonis died a violent death, we must inquire whether a like fate befell Cinyras. There are three accounts, and according to two of them he did, whereas the third makes him live to be 160 years old. Perhaps in the latter story, we have an indication that the name Cinyras was regularly used by a series of monarchs, just as Augustus was among the Caesars. And in connection therewith, we must not forget that there is a Jewish tradition that Hiram of Tyre lived for over 400 years, namely down to the destruction of the temple. The other two versions are no doubt nearer the truth. One is that he ventured to challenge Apollo to a trial of skill in music, was defeated, and then slain by the god for his presumption in daring to challenge him. This story is almost identical with that told of Marsyas, who also was a lover of Astarte and was slain and flayed by Apollo, who then hung his skin on a tree. Similar gruesome rites occur in other parts of the world, notably in Mexico, and we cannot avoid the conclusion that the legend describes a former practice of slaying the human representative of the divine lover and hanging him, or his skin, on a tree as part of the fertility rites. Even in the time of the empire, the figure of a man was hung on a tree as part of the ceremonies of Cybele, and this no doubt was a substitute for the real man. The other story relates that when he discovered that he had committed incest, he slew himself. This version suggests that the old king was sacrificed when a son had been born to him, into whom the divine soul passed at birth, or at any rate could pass as soon as necessary. We may take it, however, that these early Cypriot kings who represented the dying god sooner or later had to enact their part in deadly earnest, although in later years the civilizing influence of Greek thought no doubt mitigated the horror of the rite by substituting a dramatic representation of the death, or by the use of an image instead of a real man. Thus far we have learned that throughout Syria, Phoenicia, and Cyprus, the Semitic races worshipped Astarte and a god, who, as the lover of Astarte, was called Tammuz or Adonis, but who when viewed apart from her was usually called Melkarth or Baal. We find that the Semitic kings represented this god, and like him had annually to marry the goddess, or rather some representative of her. Like their divine namesake, they were also apparently slain, although whether this occurred after a stated period, when a son was born to them, or when they grew old is not quite clear. We have seen that any one of the king's sons might inherit his divinity, and therefore suffer the same fate as Adonis. For these reasons, it will be of interest to discover the nature of the death they had to die. It is clear that the important thing was that the god-man should die, and the exact method probably varied from place to place, and from one period to another. In some of the more savage districts, such as the Caucasus, the victim was stabbed in the side with a spear, and there seemed to be traces of his being fastened to a tree before he was stabbed, according to the old legends. And in the Philippines, this method survived almost to the present day. Sometimes the whole of the male member was cut off, and the man bled to death, and in other places he was burnt. We may suspect a tendency in latter years to mitigate the cruelty of the death involved by knocking the victim on the head before throwing him into the fire. Of these various methods, fire seems to have been the most popular among the Semites, and we will therefore dispose of the first two as quickly as possible. Among the Albanians in the Caucasus, there was a great sanctuary to the moon, ruled by a high priest, to which were attached a number of sacred men. Sooner or later, the divine spirit was supposed to descend into one of them, and he wandered about through the forests prophesying. He was then seized and brought back to the temple, where he was kept in semi-royal state for a year, like the god king in Mexico. At the end of that period, he was sacrificed to the moon by having a spear thrust into his side. The worshippers drew omens from the position in which the body fell, and afterwards stood on it as an act of purification. In this spear we may perhaps see the famous spear of Marduk, and as its descendant, the spear of the Holy Grail legends, which continually dropped blood. We have already seen that Marsyas was slain, and his skin hung on a tree, and a similar fate seems to have befallen Cinyras, another lover of Astarte. These show that this was a method employed to kill the human representative of Tammuz. Among the Norse, men were sacrificed to Odin in Uppsala by being hung on a tree, but sometimes the victims were hung and then stabbed with a spear. Indeed, Odin himself is said to have hung himself on a tree, And in the poem called Havamal, he says, I know that I hung on the windy tree for 9 whole nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself. It has been suggested that the Old English custom of hanging and then disemboweling criminals arose from the fact that criminals were formerly sacrificed to Odin in order to propitiate the god, who would be incensed by their crimes. In any case, the last line of the above verse is most significant, for it is the god-man, the victim, speaking to the god. In like manner, every human representative of Tammuz might have spoken. A modern example of this ghastly rite survived until quite recently among the Bagobos of Mindanao, one of the Philippine islands. Each December, when Orion appeared at 7 p.m., the people sacrificed a slave as a preliminary to sowing. This custom is thus precisely similar to the ideas underlying the slaying of Tammuz, who nominally died by mating with Astarte, or, in other words, represents the corn which is planted in the womb of Mother Earth. The poor wretch was led to a big tree in the forest, tied with his back to the tree, and his arms fastened high above his head. As he thus hung by his arms, a spear was thrust through his side just beneath the armpit. Then the body was severed in twain at the waistline, and the upper half left hanging, so that the fertilizing blood might drain down into the soil. We cannot help suspecting that the cutting in two of the body replaced an older process, which, as indicated in the story of Addis, consisted in cutting off the male organ and leaving the man to bleed slowly to death. Doubtless, as the original idea became forgotten more and more, stress was laid on the fertilizing quality of the blood, and hence it seemed desirable to obtain as large a diffusion as possible. The custom of sacrificing animals by hanging and then stabbing them was widespread in Asia Minor, and at Hierapolis itself, the victims were hung on a tree before they were burnt. We thus see that there is abundant evidence to show that in many areas, the human representatives of Adonis perished by being fastened to a tree and stabbed. And a tree, in fact, is constantly associated with the sacrifice, no matter whether the victim is stabbed or, as at Hierapolis, burnt. Let us now turn to the method of cutting off the male member and then letting the victim bleed to death. The slow cruelty of this method seems quite early to have led to its mitigation, and the rite developed in two directions. Either the victim lost his virile organ, but the bleeding was stopped, or else a more expeditious method of causing his death was adopted, usually that of stabbing. The story of Addis shows, however, what was the original method. Addis was the son and also the lover of Cybele, and was conceived by his mother, although a virgin, because she put a pomegranate seed, or alternatively an almond, into her bosom. Undoubtedly, he is the same god as Adonis, and one form of the legend says that he too was slain by a boar, but the other form declares that he cut off his male member under a pine tree and bled to death. Servius, however, significantly says that the wound was not self-inflicted. It was because of this story that his priests, the Galli, similarly mutilated themselves, but without the same fatal results. In his rites, which were celebrated by the Romans at the shrine of Cybele at the Vatican, a figure of the god was hung on a tree on March 23rd in each year. But as we shall have to consider this primitive and barbarous form of the fertility rite in some detail later, here we need only emphasize the manner of his death, which unquestionably represents the way in which his human representatives died. It should also be noted that Set similarly cut off the male member of Osiris, which was swallowed by a fish, and in the Egyptian story of the two brothers, the younger brother, when falsely accused of having seduced his elder brother's wife, cut off his male organ and flung it into the river Nile, where it was also swallowed by a fish. Undoubtedly, in the story of the two brothers, we have a distorted tradition of the old fertility rites, even the transmigration of the soul into a tree, and its ultimate rebirth into human form being included. The most usual method, however, seems to have included burning, though often we find that the victim was killed before being placed on the funeral pyre. It is this form of death which seems peculiarly associated with Melkarth or Moloch, for not only were victims burnt in his honor, but the god himself, or at least his image, was annually burnt. If therefore the god himself was burnt, we must not be surprised if we find traces of the same fate being meted out to his earthly representatives, even when they were kings, although in latter years this ceremony was mitigated by permitting the king merely to walk through the fire. Melkarth of Tyre was adopted by the Greeks under the name of Hercules. According to their fables, when he felt the pain of the poisoned cloak eating into his flesh, which cloak, be it noted, was sent to him by his wife and donned by him when about to offer a sacrifice, he climbed onto a pyre and persuaded his friend to set fire to it. His soul then ascended in a cloud while the thunder crashed overhead. Although the version given by Sophocles states that the scene of his transference took place on Mount Ota, another account places it at Tyre, which is certainly in a sense more correct. An annual festival held in January at Tyre commemorated this event and was called the Awakening of Hercules. We thus see that not only was there a dramatic representation of the death of the god, but also of his resurrection. As is often the case, we must turn to Greek sources for a connected account of the life of this essentially Semitic god. Hercules, though fathered by Zeus, had a human mother, and soon became famous for his enormous strength. Even when a tiny baby, he strangled two huge snakes, an incident which no doubt points to his association with serpent worship, which is usually connected with gods of fertility. All the legends indicate that, coupled with superhuman strength, he possessed a peculiar and almost demoniacal temper, which at times turned into homicidal madness. He was closely associated with the lion, whose skin he wore, which together with his other peculiarities show that he, like other forms of the deity in Syria, was originally a lion god, and of a savage and bloodthirsty nature. The chief incidents in his life, known to most of my readers, are the 12 labors. The majority of these obviously refer to the passage of the sun through the signs of the zodiac, more particularly in relation to the work and difficulties which the peasant farmer had to face during the various months of the year. Thus his slaying of the Erymanthian boar is but an allegory of the efforts needed from most farmers to destroy wild boars, which in primitive times did enormous damage to the growing crops. In similar manner, his capture of the hind Serenitis indicates another type of animal which preyed on the farmer's crops. A careful study of the labors shows that originally there were only 10, corresponding to the ancient year of 10, not 12 months. My readers are doubtless aware that in Mediterranean countries, in ancient days, the year originally consisted of only 10 months, and it was the Roman king Numa who reformed the calendar and added two new ones, which henceforth bore the names of January and February. To this day, the last month of the year is called December, which means the 10th and not the 12th. The change was due to the growth of more precise knowledge of the course of the sun and of astronomy, and has left its traces in the legends of Hercules. Tradition relates that the hard taskmaster of Hercules, Eurystheus, by a legal quibble refused to accept two of the original series, although he had only claimed 10 labors, and insisted on two more as substitutes for those whose accomplishment he considered technically not complete. Now these last two labors, which are called the 11th and 12th, are of quite a different type from the others, and appear to be part of the traditional history of what befell Hercules after his death on the pyre. They were transferred to his mortal life in order to make two more labors, corresponding with the new months, whose acceptance gradually spread westward. These two labors really depict the journey of the dead hero through the underworld and onto the Isles of the Blessed. The latter was a kind of earthly paradise to which the souls of the heroes went, but it must not be confounded with Mount Olympus, the high heavens, where only the gods dwelt. Hercules was ultimately admitted into Olympus because of his divine soul, but according to Lucian, His human soul remained with the other shades in the Isles of the Blessed. This careful distinction between the divine and human souls of these god-men is important to us, as it explains how it was that the divine soul of the dying representative of Adonis could be transferred to a living successor. The two episodes have not only been transferred to this world, but have been transposed, a fact which still further disguises their true meaning. Taking therefore the 12th labor first, we find Hercules was sent to carry off Cerberus from the underworld. He was not content to do this only, but tried to rescue the souls which were in bondage. Most great religions tell of some beneficent being who thus descended into the underworld to aid those who were in anguish. The Christian Church specifically says it was Christ, while the Chinese Buddhists say that the blessed Kuan Yin in like manner rescued those who were in hell. In the case of Hercules, we seem to have a dim remembrance, therefore, of the descent of Melkarth, that is Tammuz, into the underworld, and of the alleviation which he brought to sufferers therein. Another interesting detail is that Hercules is said to have taken the precaution of being first initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, from whose priests he obtained the information necessary to enable him to enter in safety the awful regions of the dead. He was then led by Hermes, the conductor of the dead, into the underworld, and at the gates of Hades, Hercules released Theseus from the torment he was in, and later Aesculapius, the king of the underworld, Hades, tried to bar his path, but Hercules wounded him so sore that he was only too glad to grant his request, and so Hercules carried off Cerberus in triumph. The 11th labor, which should have followed the above, was to fetch the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. These represent the Isles of the Blessed, and during this adventure, he was nearly offered up as a human sacrifice in Egypt. Ultimately, he obtained the apples through the help of the giant Atlas. But when they were laid on the altar of Pallas Athene, significantly enough, she wafted them back to the Isles of the Hesperides in the west. The death of Hercules occurred in this manner. Hercules had married Deianira after divorcing his first wife, but his wayward fancy caused him to look favorably on a third lady, Iole, or at any rate so Deianira believed. When therefore he sent a message asking her to send him his sacrificial robes, she poured on to the garments liquid from a phial, which she believed to be a love potion. It was, however, a deadly poison, and as soon as Hercules put on the robe, the flames of the sacrificial fire caused the poison to penetrate into his flesh. Unable to bear the agony, he climbed a funeral pyre, which, at his earnest request, was fired by his friend Philoctetes. As the flames rushed upward, a great cloud descended. The lightnings flamed across the sky, and amid the roar of thunder, Pallas Athene bore the demigod to heaven in her chariot. Here, as a token of reconciliation, his lifelong enemy Hera bestowed on him the hand of her daughter Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth. In this Greek legend, we have undoubtedly the main outline of the supposed career of Melkarth, save only that the descent into the underworld, corresponding to the initiation rite of being swallowed by a monster, should come after the burning. Then should come the journey to the Hesperides, and only thereafter the ascent into heaven. Unless, indeed, we prefer to regard the incidents of the underworld and of the Hesperides as appertaining to the human soul of the representatives of Melkarth, while the divine soul ascended direct to heaven from the funeral pyre. From the preceding summary of the life of Hercules, we see that much therein is in striking analogy with Tammuz, and although the Greeks distinguished him from Adonis, this was, I suggest, because they failed to recognize that Melkarth and Tammuz were but different aspects of the same Semitic deity. That Melkarth and Hercules are identical no scholars deny, and we can even trace the evolution of the Greek artistic conception of Hercules from certain sculptures of Melkarth, which have been found in Cyprus. At Gades, the modern Cadiz in Spain, the Phoenicians annually burnt a gigantic figure of Melkarth, and there is abundant evidence to show that the custom was widespread. In like manner at Tarsus, in Cilicia, Sandan, the fertility god of that area, was annually burnt, and by the Greeks he was identified with Hercules. Now, as Sandan was the father of Cinyras of Cyprus and grandfather of the ill-fated Adonis, it is extremely important to find that he was the same as Melkarth, and that his statue was regularly burnt, for thereby we complete the tale of the fatal history of these early priest-kings, or god-men, the lovers of the destroying goddess Astarte, who was alike the great mother and the Semitic goddess of war. At Tarsus, the god Sandon was burnt in effigy, and the coins of the city show that the pyre rested on an altar with a figure of Sandon in the midst. An eagle perches on the top of the pyre, and doubtless represents the soul of the god about to ascend to heaven. This latter detail is important and should be compared with the eagle, which is being released by the Babylonian deity on the seal depicting the descent of Tammuz, or Shamash, into the underworld, page 28. Probably it was a real eagle, which was released at the psychological moment, for this was certainly the procedure at the funeral of a Roman emperor. At death, or sometimes before death, the Roman emperors were deified, and therefore when one died, an effigy was solemnly cremated upright on a pyre, and at the same moment an eagle was let loose from the top of the pyre to symbolize the ascent of the divine soul of the emperor to the abode of the gods. The chief symbol of Sandan was the axe, especially a double-headed axe, which in general appearance looks very much like a gavel. We shall find this symbol elsewhere associated with the Syrian god of fertility. But before wandering further north, let us retrace our steps towards Syria proper. We thus see that the Syrians burnt their god annually. The exact reason for the custom is still a matter of question, but the most generally accepted view is that thereby they purified the god by destroying his earthly body, or its substitute, so that his spirit might ascend pure and unsullied to the heavens, and thence reincarnate in a new body. The burning of an effigy is merely a substitute for the burning of a man, such substitutions taking place when civilization had advanced sufficiently to make human sacrifices abhorrent to the majority. Moreover, the custom is more reasonable if the figure represents the god-man himself. In brief, the king of the country represented the god of fertility, and like Tammuz, had annually to marry the goddess, who was usually represented by one of her sacred women, although perhaps at a later date here, also a statue was substituted. At such times there was a considerable amount of promiscuous intercourse among the worshippers, intended as sympathetic magic which would increase the fertility of the whole country. As Tammuz was slain, his human embodiment had also to be slain, and so the life of these divine kings would tend to be a short one. In practice, however, an annual slaying of the king had obvious disadvantages, not for the man, for primitive communities have but little regard for the feelings of the individual, but for the whole community. To meet this difficulty, a tendency grew up to appoint a substitute king for each year, dress him in the royal robes, crown him with the king's crown, and treat him royally. At the end of his year of office, this king was slain, and another took his place. Operative Masons will at once perceive the similarity to their drama. Such substitute kings survived until quite recent times in Europe, although no longer subject to the fear of real death, since this part resolved itself into play acting. Unquestionably, the Lord of Misrule, who in England presided over the Christmas revels for 12 days, is the lineal descendant of the King Saturn, who was made king in mockery and killed in deadly earnest at the Saturnalia held by the Roman legionaries. These substitutes for the king were probably of royal or semi-royal descent, children of his concubines or of the sacred women. But though for a time they might thus save their father, there came a time when the real king himself had originally to follow the same cruel path. This was when his bodily strength, and especially his capacity to beget offspring, began to wane, and I shall give examples of the survival of this custom in some parts of the world today, at a later stage in the book. A familiar example to all students is the priest king at Nemi. Any man who could tear a bough of mistletoe from the oak tree which he guarded at Nemi could attack the priest king with impunity, and if he succeeded in slaying him, he became priest king in his stead, till he too went forth by the same road. To this day, a similar custom exists among the devil worshippers of Kurdistan. The last chief was in open Durbar murdered by his brother, who at once assumed the throne and was acknowledged as lawful ruler by the community. Thus, there was an annual slaying of a substitute king and an occasional slaying of the real king. In the course of time, both tragedies were modified, the former by a dramatic representation or by the substitution of a statue, as at Tarsus, the latter by allowing the king to walk through the fire instead of being burnt in it. No doubt once this substitution had become accepted, there would be places where the king would do without any substitute and merely walk through the fire each year, as was the case at Tyre, or else enact the whole drama, as occurred at Babylon. That the kings of Tyre did have to walk through the fire, we learn from Ezekiel, and also that they claimed to be gods. Such walking the fires still occur in India, Fiji, and elsewhere, and while some of them seem to have evolved from a different idea, namely from a desire to test the candidate's faith, purity, etc., the conclusive evidence we possess that the Phoenicians burnt their god annually and that their kings claimed to be divine leaves no doubt that the fire walk of the king of Tyre was a substitute for death by fire. We have abundant evidence also that human victims were regularly, at one time, sacrificed to Astarte. Even the Greeks were guilty of this appalling custom. For example, men and women were sacrificed to the Tauric Artemis, being first slain by the sword and then burnt. Iphigenia had to do this horrible work, and her brother Orestes carried off the statue of the goddess to Greece, where, according to the legends, he established the same terrible custom. No doubt the ashes of such victims were then scattered to the 4 cardinal points of heaven, so that they might fertilize the soil. In India, the dead are burnt in honor of Shiva, whose title is He That Destroys. Their ashes are then scattered over the waters of the Ganges, not in order that no remnant of so vile a wretch may remain, but as a symbolic sacrifice to Mother Ganges. In the Christian burial service, the same idea survives, for the priest scatters a handful of earth on the coffin with the significant words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. As a result of our investigations, we are compelled to believe that originally the victims were hung on a tree, castrated, and allowed to bleed to death in order that their blood might fertilize the soil. Then the corpse was burnt and the ashes scattered over the field. Later, as in the example quoted from the Philippines, the body would be severed in twain and then subsequently burnt. In connection therewith, we must not forget what we have already learned, namely, that criminals often inherit as their punishment the mode of sacrificing a victim, because in order to expiate their offense against the angry God, they were sacrificed to him. If the penalty of hanging and drawing, i.e., disemboweling, a culprit originated in the custom of sacrificing a victim to Odin in that manner, similar cruel penalties no doubt can be traced back to the same idea. In India, Vishnu is said to have taken on the form of a lion in order to overthrow a terrible ogre, whom he slew by disemboweling him, and in this lion incarnation he is often shown making a certain peculiar sign, namely, pointing with both hands to his stomach as if about to tear it open. The sign therefore shows that it was Vishnu who was originally disemboweled, and no doubt he, like Odin, sacrificed himself to himself. Vishnu indeed has many of the characteristics of Hiram Abiff, and probably he originally represented a god of vegetation, although as the solar cult evolved, he came to represent the sun at its meridian. Nevertheless, he is still closely associated with the element of water, and also with corn. The Chinese likewise use this sign and call it the sign of earth, a fact of obvious significance. If you sever a hanging body at the waist, the bowels will gush out, and it would seem that Judas Iscariot must have been similarly cut in half. Otherwise, how could he, by hanging himself, cause his bowels to gush forth? It would therefore appear as if at one period in the evolution of the fertility rites, the representative of Tammuz was hung on a tree, his body severed in twain, his bowels torn out, and the body finally burnt to ashes at the center of the court of the temple, on the altar of sacrifice. That a more merciful death than that of being slowly burnt was granted to the victims offered to Astarte, we know from ancient records. At Salamis, in Cyprus, despite the humanizing influence of Greece, human sacrifices continued to be made up to the time of the Emperor Hadrian. They were offered in the month of Aphrodite to Diomede, but he shared the sanctuary with Agraulis, said to be the daughter of Cecrops, but who no doubt really represented the ubiquitous Astarte, and originally the sacrifices were offered to her. Stay tuned for the next part of this book. Peace, blessings, much love and enlightenment to you all. Shalom.